The story of the American West and its legacy on American culture has long excited both professional historians and the broader public. As far back as the 1890s, historian Frederick Jackson Turner presented a narrative of American history that placed the frontier at the forefront of shaping American democracy, culture, and identity. Between the 1940s and 1960s, cowboy western films reigned supreme, cementing a popular image of the cowboy as a paragon of rugged individualism. However, the story of the Cowboys is much more complex than it might seem in the movies. To speak with us on this topic is journalist David Griscom, who is currently writing a book on the history of cowboys and populism in Texas. The book is entitled Cutting Fences and will be up for pre-order next month. I'm Patrick Needham.
And I'm Djene.
And this is Talking History.
Welcome to Talking History, David.
Thank you all so much for having me on.
So we're really excited to talk to you about this book that you're currently writing, which is looking at the history of populism in Texas, a state that we often, associate with, perhaps conservative politics, but actually, especially at the end of the 19th century and in the early 20th century, it was a kind of hotbed of labor radicalism. So your book is going to be coming out sometime this year, I believe. It'll be up for pre-order soon. So, we've had a kind of look up parts of the book that you've written so far. And I wanted to talk to you specifically about sort of Texas, between the end of the Civil War and the rise of the populist movement, which we'll discuss in the 1890s. So in the early chapters of your book, your narrative kind of begins at this place called Tascosa in Texas in the late 1870s. It's kind of, you compare it to Dodge City. I think everybody who's familiar with, even my father growing up in Iraq in the 1960s and 70s knew about Dodge City from the cowboy movies. So it's a place like Dodge City. Can you talk to us a little bit about where is Tascosa, specifically in Texas? What drew people to this place, and what was life like in this sort of quote-unquote frontier town?
Yeah, well, it not only is it kind of like Dodge City, it was connected deeply to Dodge City. Dodge City was the end of the big cattle drives, which many of them originated in Tascosa, Texas. And, this was a place where, after the Civil War, obviously there's a lot of movement of people across the South, and particularly in Texas. This is also coinciding with the Indian Wars as well. So the panhandle of Texas becomes displaced because of the displacement, because of the war on the native and indigenous peoples of Texas. It becomes this place where there are a lot of these kind of boom towns popping up. And Tascosa is interesting because it first is settled with the idea by a fellow named Casimiro Romero that it would be a perfect place to raise sheep. And he ends up being there for a few years until giving it up and going up to Dodge City for a period of time. When he returns, it was no longer a place to raise sheep, but a place to raise cattle. So there's those first early years of this place was already kind of in flux. And, in the early years, it was a place where people were raising cattle. But eventually, as across Texas and a lot of the South as well, a lot of big European and Northern capital comes in and starts buying up significant parts of the land. And this fundamentally changes work in the community, which is one of the things I tried to get into my book is like, there is all this kind of mythology of the cowboy and the Old West, and there's a fair amount of truth to some of that mythology. But what's really important, and I think a lot of people miss, is that these were places that were subjected to the same kind of conditions as anywhere else in the world, the rule of money, the rule of law. And as labor started to change in the area, the actual work of cowboying changed. And we can get a little bit more into, the strike and some of the things that ended up happening, why it is such an interesting place. But it really is a place where, the kind of the old world of the open range and that Old West idea starts to sort of rub up against modernity and new industrial capital.
So who were these cowboys in Texas, and what kind of issues were they facing as far as the changing landscape of labor at the time?
Certainly. Texas is a big state. So, talking about cowboys was probably too broad. These cowboys specifically tended to be white. They were, for the most part, actually Southern refugees, right? So people who had left the South after the Civil War. So they had probably only been in Texas for a little while. Now, that's not the case for all of them. There were many skilled cowboys who had been doing this kind of work for a very long time. And, the thing that you have to distinguish is between like the cowboy as a worker and the ranchers, right? There were cowboys who would work a herd of cattle for a rancher, and typically the old model was, "Hey, I'll work your large herd that you have, and I'm able to sort of claim any unclaimed cattle that we might find while we're taking care of the cattle, and I'm also able to basically have my herd alongside your herd." And this was the way for somebody who didn't have anything to kind of climb up the ladder. And what ends up happening, at this period in the 1880s, is these big landlords start consolidating ranch land. You also start having absentee landlords, so people who might own a big ranch, but they don't live there, and they have other folks managing it. And they don't like this idea of maybe there being competition between, the hired workers and, their cattle industry. So they start to ban mavericking, which was the practice of being able to grab cattle, unclaimed cattle. They start enforcing basically wage labor instead of maybe getting paid by being able to get a percentage of the herd at the end of the cattle drive. So basically, what ends up happening is because this concentrated form of capital and capitalism starts encroaching upon that kind of older model of kind of small scale ranches. Now these large scale ranches start sort of pushing wage labor over those kind of more older versions of compensation for cowboy workers there.
So basically, in the old days, you might be working for somebody who's wealthier than you, but the kind of deal you got was a lot better, and there was a lot more opportunity in sort of that older way of working for you to, like you said, rise up to maybe be able to save up a significant amount of money to build up your own, build up your own business. However, with this sort of influx of big money, this consolidation of land, of control of the land, and I'm assuming of control of the local political apparatus as well, means that you're now a wage laborer. And yes, maybe somebody might be able to be successful after being a wage laborer, but it's not the same kind of flexibility that they would have got in the past.
Exactly. And, there's an important point that you noted about like being able to navigate the political scene and the legal scene, in addition to what's happening with, these cowboys who are working the cattle. Small land holders around the area started to lose their land. And it's kind of interesting the way that a lot of these big landowners were able to sort of grab land from some of these small holds. Effectively, Texas passed a law that said that if you put a certain amount of money and improvements into the land, you could make a claim for it. And what ended up happening is all across the Panhandle, all across Texas, to be frank, people would find on their land suspicious improvements that they had never, asked for or knew anything about. And those were used to actually dispossess a lot of these small holders who, probably were coming, and when they kind of settled there, were living there at a time where like you might not have a very easy paper trail to be able to prove ownership. And didn't help that, many of the big landowners were friendly with the political establishment and the judges in Texas. So these were people who not only had access to capital and land and all this, but they also did have such ease of navigating the political and legal system in Texas that they were really able to get their way.
So basically, we're dealing with a situation where it's as if somebody came up to my house while I was on holiday, built a new sunroom, and then went to the judge and said, "This is now my house."
Maybe not as luxurious unless you're a cow, but very similar. They would find things like corrals on their land. It was definitely a surprise for sure.
So, David, you write of the Great Cowboy Strike. How did these Panhandle cowboys react to this changing landscape?
Yeah. Well, I have to shout out Mark Laus, who wrote a great book for Verso in 2017 called The Great Cowboy Strike, who really outlines this and sort of how it spread across the West. But the story is very interesting. And it's very interesting to me as a historian and as a Texan, because, these are cowboys who very much embody, these kind of values of, in most people's mind, the myth around them is that these people embody, ideas of like rugged individualism. But what ends up happening is a bunch of these cowboys start to get frustrated with the way that they're getting squeezed. And it's very clear that many of the big ranches around are sort of coordinating with one another. So a group of these cowboys get together, led by a few folks named Tom Harris, Roy Griffin, and J.W. Peacock. And these were all wagon bosses. And we haven't really gotten into it, but the work here, for the most part, was moving these big herds of cattle from Texas to Dodge City so it could meet the railroads and then go and be sold to market, and particularly in Chicago, but also in the Northeast. So you have, you basically have this excess of cattle in Texas where it's very, very cheap. I mean, in fact, there's wild longhorns at this period of time, unclaimed. People would find them on the range. So it was very, very cheap to get cattle in Texas, but that meant you could sell it very highly there. So they came up with this idea that is, kind of absurd, frankly, to move, these massive herds all across Oklahoma and then Kansas. These are the stories of things like Lonesome Dove. Anyway, this work particularly began in the spring. And you needed to do it at a moment where there was enough grass to feed your herd, but it was also not too cold and dangerous for you to be able to make the trek. And it was one of those kind of things where the earlier you get the herd to market, the higher price you're going to receive for it. So these cowboys get together and they start talking about the changes in their work. And they sign this very interesting document where they make demands on how much each cowboy will be paid. Cowboys would not be paid less than $50 per month. They also demanded that cooks shall certainly receive $50 a month as well. And anyone who was running one of these outfits would receive $75 per month. So these are folks who are saying these are the minimum wages, basically, that we will work for. And it was cowboys who were working among all of the major ranches around. So it was something of a union. It was something of a strike. They timed it perfectly by doing it in the spring, kind of sprung it upon the landowners. And it's an interesting story as to how it's kind of known in Texas and the history around how this event has been thought of. But it seems that they won the strike quite quickly, which has sort of added, I think, to some of the historical confusion around it. But yeah, no doubt about it that all these cowboys from these many different ranches in the area organized themselves together, put out their call for the wages that they would all receive. And one thing that I will just note is that Tom Harris and Griffin and Peacock, these are all guys who are making more than was being demanded as the minimum here. So these were people who were actually going out on a limb, risking their own livelihood for the benefit of these other cowboys in the area.
So these weren't the most the leaders of this kind of strike were not the most impoverished elements of the cowboy community, but they evidently saw, which direction the wind was blowing, and kind of brought the cowboys together to kind of corral the labor and force a kind of minimum, like a minimum wage for the type of work that they were doing. So how did the landowners react to this?
I mean, very badly, as you can imagine. There's interesting stories of some of the negotiations between the cattle barons and these cowboys, where they met in the middle of and they met way outside of any kind of town. And after refusing some of the lowball wages that were offered by the landowners, the cowboys were told that the horses that you're riding belong to the company, and you're going to have to walk, upwards of like 5, 8 miles back into town. So, very brutally. There are some reports of violence. Tascosa was a kind of a rough and tumble town at the time. Particularly, it seems that there were threats by some of the goons and thugs of the major ranches against the Cowboys. But interestingly enough, one of the things that they tried to do was to basically say, "Oh, well, we will accept the wages that you're demanding, and then when it's time to pay, not pay them." One of the tactics that the ranch owners had wanted their negotiators to do was to say that they would accept the minimum wage of those cowboys and then to not pay them when it came time to pay, right? To basically run out the clock. But they were unsuccessful in doing this. And we have information from the U.S. Commissioner of Labor that says that the Cowboys won their strike. So because it was timed so perfectly at such a critical moment, for the cattle drive, they were basically in control. Now, the long term of the Cowboy strike is where things get a little bit difficult, because even though it seems like they were able to win those wages in that initial season, most of the leaders that signed this letter were basically blacklisted. And no longer were able to work for the major ranches. There are legends that there was a company that was started nearby called the Get Even Cattle Company. And it was very likely led and run by many of the leaders of that strike.
So basically, they had this short-term victory, but in the longer term, the cattle ranching oligarchy basically singled these leaders out as troublemakers in order to kind of get retribution in the long term. So I want to kind of shift a little bit of focus here. So obviously, the Cowboy strike that you've been talking about, this was kind of centered around certain economic demands. But one of the topics that you address in your book is the sort of linkage between this let's say labor radicalism and the emergence of populism in Texas. We're very used to in the United States today of thinking of America as being a kind of settled two-party system. You have Republicans, you have Democrats, but you have in the 1890s the emergence of kind of new political forces in Texas politics. So can you perhaps talk about sort of how this feeds into the growth of the populist movement in Texas? Are the Cowboys the only element of this populist movement? Do they ally with other elements of the populist movement, other elements of society to build this movement? What's happened? How does this translate into politics in the sort of 1890s?
Yeah, so I think the connection here is mostly about how people were reacting to the changes. The populist movement in Texas and populism itself is kind of founded in Lampasas, Texas in 1875. So this is right around the same time as the story of the Cowboy strikes. In fact, a couple years earlier. So really the connection here is that there is the same kind of dispossession of rural people from the land, and this kind of closing in on this concept of the open range. Now, Texas was one of these places that had massive population increases after the Civil War. All across the South, you would see written on people's door, GTT, gone to Texas. And the dream was that Texas was a place that anyone who was willing to work could come and find themselves a homestead. Well, very quickly, the land sort of got claimed, not just by this influx of folks, but particularly by the railroad companies who were induced by the state of Texas to come and lay track all across Texas. Texas was also very cash poor at this period of time after the Civil War. So it became a very enticing place for, again, northern and particularly British capital to come and buy up significant portions of the land. But the most damaging about this is what's called the crop lien system, which most people who know about populism probably come across before. And that was basically the system of debt that farmers fell into to produce particularly cotton. It's one of those things, if anybody who knows anything about the farming cycle, you got to buy a bunch of material at the beginning of the year, and then you have to kind of sit and wait for you to get any return on it. Well, merchants across the state of Texas and all across the state, all across the South, created this system called the crop lien system, where they They gave people credit on the future cotton harvest. Problem was is that the cotton prices weren't always stable, and people were oftentimes finding themselves at the end of the season massively in debt to these merchants. This led to a lot of people losing their land. And by the 1890s and the 1900s, you had people whose family might have farmed the land that you're working on, but you were now a tenant on a land that your father or your grandfather had worked on. So obviously this creates significant frustration with the economic and the political system. And the Farmers Alliance was this group that at first tried to just understand what it was happening, what was the root of this crisis. And they came up with different kinds of economic strategies to get around it. Somebody named Charles McCune, for example, came up with this idea of storing all of the cotton in these collectively owned warehouses so that farmers could sell at a time when the cotton price was the best for them, to be able to take out low interest loans from those warehouses to sort of get around the predatory system of the crop lien system in the South. But eventually they started to realize that without the capital and without the organization, a lot of those strategies were not going to be successful. So they start turning to politics. And what's very interesting about it, much like the Cowboys in Tascosa, is the fact that a lot of these farmers were reading quite widely. And they were reading about different kinds of ideas of labor organizing, of kind of crazy ideas like socialism, and were coming up with ways to sort of build that in their communities. The People's Party was a longtime dream of many of these early populists, and it really kicks into gear again in the 1890s. As you start to see the farmers, the poor farmers, becoming their own voting bloc. So Governor Hogg of Texas is kind of the beginning of populism in the sense is like he's a Democrat who's elected on many of the demands of the farmers, but he betrays the farmers movement. So the division within the populist movement, that was some of them were still loyal to the Democratic Party, and some of them wanted to create a third independent party. He kind of splits that debate in half, and the vast majority, particularly of the poor farmers, go and create the People's Party. And the People's Party has really incredible success in its first few years of running for office in Texas. Governor's elections were held every 2 years back then, and each election in the 90s, the populist movement continues to grow and grow and grow, up until 1896, where they put up massive numbers. They become the second largest party in the state of Texas. I believe they get something around 44% of the vote. But a lot of scholars and people who studied the time believe that the Texas Democrats probably rigged the election to ensure that they were victorious in that. And that's because Texas for a long time had been a one-party state. You had Democrat machines controlling access to the ballot in many parts of the state. And, so there's this incredible moment of Texas populism in 1896 that happens at the same time as the national populist movement and the People's Party is beginning to collapse as the People's Party becomes absorbed into the National Democratic Party. The populist movement in Texas lives a lot longer than it does in other parts of the country, I think, because of its success in those elections. But yes, I mean, it's a very fascinating moment, and I think a lot of people have heard of populism. A lot of people don't know the history of Texas populism or how successful that it was here.
Well, David, that's a fascinating story about sort of a kind of forgotten chapter of Texas history. I really appreciate having you on to talk about this, and hopefully sometime down the line we can have you on again to talk about some of the other parts of your book and how this story kind of proceeds after the 1890s.
Thank you for joining us for Talking History, a presentation of KSMU and the Missouri State University Department of History. You can catch us every first Thursday at 12:06 after NPR News. This show is available along with our entire back catalog at ksmu.org or wherever podcasts are found.